So one thing I forgot to set up in the very last video was the initial styles that I wanted to set for our app. I like to make use of functional styles, just more or less as ways to move things about the page without having to add CSS over and over that you could maybe never reuse. So it's kind of just a way I'm kind of converting myself to write CSS these days. It looks like a lot to take in, but really it's probably less CSS in the end for your app to use, and you can just go ahead and use different character settings like this that say, hey, padding left is 0, which is spacing none, which is a variable we set here. If this is over your head, don't worry about it. This series isn't really about CSS. I just wanted to focus on getting it to look okay out of the box. So I'm not going to spend time really discussing this, but there might be an opportunity to do that in the future in different videos I might create. So for now, I'm going to create a new partial called functions.scss, and this won't render on its own, but rather get included in our application file. So I'm going to save that down and import it here, just below BOMA. So it'll be functions. You don't need the underscore here. And then for BOMA's sake, I'd like to kind of make a few changes to link colors just in our apps, just so they're not that default blue that's so commonly used. And in this case, they're kind of a dark gray color. And a few more styles that I'll add are just going to be stuff that we're going to use later on. Notifications, I need to kind of make a little bit of refinement too, so there's no margin on it. And then later on, there'll be some styles here for instruments on the actual index path. That's just something that we're going to use grid, display grid for, which is a really cool new thing with CSS. It saves a lot of code. But anyway, I wanted to set the foundation there. There'll be more style sheets we'll actually use and change as we go. But that's kind of the starting point. And in our application file, I have a couple of yields. I'll just go ahead and get into those when we get to them, but more or less this is the main app yield, and then you can actually set your own yields to where you can do a content for tag and basically dynamically add content in a page from a different view in Rails. That'll make more sense later on, but that's just kind of what's happening here if you saw that and weren't quite sure what was going on. So with that said, we have, I think, everything loaded we need. We can go ahead and start generating our first model. That's going to be the instrument model. And it's going to have quite a few parameters on it. So let's go ahead and scaffold that out. I might go ahead and initialize this repo though. Just call it init. Cool. So our first one's going to be called instrument, and it's going to be a long one. So Rails generates scaffold, capitalize instrument, and we're going to have a brand. It's going to be a string, a model, string, description, text, condition, string, finish. And I'm more or less gearing this around guitars. I'm a guitar player by day and night, I guess. I'm kind of I don't know how you would call it, professional, I guess, because I am in a couple bands and play throughout the area for cash and stuff on the weekends. It's fun. But anyway, this is kind of a side hustle thing I do for fun. So apologies if you're not a guitarist, but this can relate to anything else you want to do too. So price is going to be a decimal in this case. That can also be an integer if you want it to be. I think it really just depends on what you're going to do. Looking back, I probably should have made this an integer, but I'm going to run with decimal for now. Just something to note. And then we're also going to have to do a few refinements on that specific column once we generate this scaffold. So go ahead and do that. And it's going to generate pretty much everything you need out of the box. The only thing I don't want to really have that had been added is the scaffold style sheet. We can go ahead and revert that back just by deleting it. So go to assets, style sheets, scaffolds, delete. Okay. And you'll notice it created its own instrument style sheet too, which will, by default, Rails will just bundle everything up that's in here and put it in the application style sheet once it's actually final. So we can go ahead and not do that. Do this one. Cool. So with that done, we have our migration. Before you run Rails DB migrate, go ahead and go into this migration. We're going to modify it just a touch to include the following. So on the price itself, I want to set a precision of 5, a scale of 2, and a default to 0. And that's more or less just thinking about this decimal in terms of an actual currency. You can do it however you want to do it, but that's just kind of what's going on there. So then we can finally run Rails DB migrate. Great. So that should be added. Let's see how that looks. I'm sure it looks terrible actually on the front end, so I think my server's still running. So you would have to go to instruments in this case. And there's going to be basically a table there because of the scaffold. If you go to new, it'll have just a bunch of ugly looking stuff here, but that's all of our stuff all ready to go. So that's great. With that intact, we can probably change our route path to be instruments by default, because that's where it's going to actually default to in the end. So we can go back to our routes. Instead of root store index here, we can do instruments. Save that. There we go. So now it redirects back to there. If yours didn't do that by default, you might need to restart your server. Just go ahead and do that, and you should be set. So this is actually a link. I made the links dark in this app, so it doesn't look quite like they should, but it's okay. I won't even have this here in the very end, so that's not a big deal. With that done, we can do some setup still. That's going to basically add carrier wave into the mix, because I want to append this form, but when you do create a new one, to have a image as well. So what I can do is go to carrier waves gem page, this one here. I have it installed. We need to run an uploader generation, and you can call this whatever you want it to be, but I'm going to call it just image. So Rails generate uploader image, capitalize it. And this creates an uploader in your file path. So uploaders here, and then image uploader. We do need to uncomment this line because we're using that for some image formatting, I guess you could call it. So it's more or less resizing images when we want them to. And I like to just uncomment the whitelisting, so it lets only these file types through. And I'm going to add a couple different versions of a cropping or resize, I guess you could call it. And the first one's going to be thumb for sure, but we're going to do a 400 by 300 dimension. And then the second one, you can add as many as you want, but just keep in mind that that increases your app size if you're using it on your own server, unless your app is hosted elsewhere. If you were to open or upload a different storage adapter, you can use like fog here and append where that should go. This is going to go in our public directory under an uploads folder. So it'll be right, where's public? Right here. There'll be an uploads folder here in a minute once we start uploading stuff. So we can do that, and I call the next one default. This is just going to be the main image size we'll use on the bigger pages or the show pages of the instrument. So resize to fit, colon, and then pass in the keys. So we need to add image to the instrument column now, or table, excuse me. So we can actually add that to our form. So let's do that in a migration. Just to add image to instruments. And we'll do image, and I believe it'll be a string. And Rails is smart to know that, hey, that's going to go on the instruments column, and it's image, it's stream. And we can just run that migration. And That should append it to our instruments table, which is here. So now we have that. And we also need a user ID on our instruments table too. So let's do that in migration next. Because this will associate a given user's account to whatever instrument they're selling. So that's kind of the idea there. So this will be an integer in this case. Let's double check that. Instruments user ID integer, perfect. So another Rails DB migrate, done. Awesome. So next order of business is establishing some relationships, I guess you could say. So with our actual uploader, we need to actually make our instrument model know about it. So to do that, you need to go to the model instrument, and here we basically have nothing so far, but that's okay. We need to do a mount uploader and then image, and this is from the carrier wave docs, so I'm just using image where they use avatar if you're on that web page. Uploader. And then since we're using SQLite as our database right now, you can do a serialize image and then of JSON. So that's just if you use SQLite. So if you use like Postgres or SQL, you wouldn't really need this. In fact, you'd do something a bit different. I wonder if it's in their docs that I could show real quick. Yeah, you would use a JSON type here when you pass that through, as opposed to an actual string, which is for SQLite. So keep that in mind. And with that done, we need to also do the belongs to user. Oops. And then I have to set optional true here. You'll see why later. This is something I probably should have taken out at the very end though. Maybe I will then. But we can also go ahead and add some validations here for our form while we're at it. And I didn't really get into this in previous series because it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's just important to do because you need some server-side validation, hopefully combined with your front-end validations. It's just kind of a good practice. So Rails comes with this stuff out of the box, so it's really convenient. But I really recommend doing some front-end validation too for your user's sake, because if you've ever submitted a form to find out something was wrong, it becomes a nightmare to have to start over again. I can't spell. True. So this line, when spelled right, validates that those line items, those fields actually have data passed through when the person clicks submit. So that's what's going on there. We also need to do validates description. And length will be, you can set a length that it should be, or at least a max. And in this case, I'm just going to throw 1,000 out there. It's a nice little handy helper you can pass through. If it's too long, you can actually pass through a message to the user here. So we can do a little placeholder count, which would actually pass through the 1,000 there. Characters is the max allowed. And you might run into like translation stuff there. That's something I'll maybe talk about for another time, but keep that in mind. Title, length. So we're setting a maximum length for the title too. And in fact, I'm going to copy this and just change messaging and the length itself. So we're going to do 140 here. Finally, price. So this line's checking our price field, of course on submit. So sadly, this doesn't happen in real time as you're typing. You probably need JavaScript or something like that to help you there. But it's saying, hey, this needs to be only an integer if you're typing that in and no more than 7 characters. So those are all set. While we're at it, you can create a shorthand array in Ruby that looks like this, and this is going to remain a constant, so I'm going to capitalize it. It's just kind of a convention. When programmers see that, they know that this thing shouldn't change, or it's just kind of a set key value kind of thing. Normally this would look like a typical array that you might be used to, so it'd be like quotes with comma separated parameters, stuff like that. If I can spell. So that would look like that in the end. This is just a quick Ruby cool way to just bypass that. So I'm going to just type these out real quick. In fact, I'm not going to type them because that would take forever. I'm going to just copy them from our other project. You can do the same. So this is going to set the brand, the finish, and the condition by default. So we can go and grab those from our form field and just display them in a select field. So that's what I'm going to end up doing. So you'll see that in a second. So I think that's enough setup for now. We'll be back here to do more work later, but in our user route, our user model, excuse me, we need to actually have just has many instruments. That should do it. We can move on to adding our form fields next in our views, just making these look a little better out of the box. So our forms here, it looks pretty atrocious to start with. So I actually might copy some markup here to save some time again. And this is for both of our sakes, but I'll talk you through it. All right, so let me save this down. And in fact, I'll go through the edit and new paths just to make this look consistent. And we'll get to show later. I won't worry about it right now. Okay, so first let me talk about the new and edit paths. So this will end up being, this should update to be a little nicer. Let's see, image uploader, what's up with that? All right, so I think what's up here is our instrument controller needs to have some TLC done to it. So what we can do is more or less just go through each action and make it sync up a bit. So do create at sending. And we also want to do some validations here, or authentication. So before action, this comes from device, and we want to authenticate user with a bang, except index and show. I did that wrong. So there needs to be a colon after accept. There we go. So aside from that, we can update this to be current user since that comes from device. We have that to work with. Then we can grab all the instruments and build them. Same is true right here. And where were we? Below here, we need to actually append image to be a whitelisted parameter. So when we pass that through, we can actually go ahead and use it on our form. See if this does it. So I need to sign in, hopefully. So we still get this constant thing. What's that about? So what happened there was the fact that I needed to restart the server. So in that case, I've got all this markup already here. We're on this path now, and I'll show you the HTML that basically generates this. So a lot of it is based on BOMA, and some of it's based on just stuff I've used over the years. So we have our basic form. We're on that new path right here. And if you recall earlier in an earlier video, I mentioned there's a different yield we use in the application root. So let me open that. Right about here, we have space for a header, and I want it to be dynamic based on the route I'm passing through. So to do that in Rails, you can actually yield your own content for this actual space. which is pretty cool. So think of it as anything with between this content for header. We do a Ruby block, and then it injects this content into that header. So sell an instrument is what you actually see in the end right here. So if I were to update that to be maybe like used instrument, it should update. There you go. So that's something to take into account. So that's pretty neat to use throughout your app if you want your views to be ultimately configurable without having to, constantly reinvent the wheel as you go. And in fact, if we were really dry, we would add all this markup to that initial setup here, and then just yield within that. So all we would yield is the actual text instead, just less code to have throughout the app. So that's something also to think about. So below, we're adding a rendering and passing through the form. And inside that form, we need access to the instrument, so you can actually pass in through that variable in this way through a partial. So that's pretty nifty. Here I just have a padding vertical class of 4 scale, so it just kind of had some space there. So the same is pretty much true on the editing instrument path. That would look like, I don't have one created, but very similar to this pretty much. The title would just be different. So with that done, we have our actual form that's generated, and this is where we're passing in that instrument field, of which is coming from our controller. So those actions are actually on the create and edit, and we're able to get that because we're setting that instrument. We're finding that parameter based on that route. That's kind of a clusterfuck to think about, but that's just kind of how it works. So we're able to get things through to our views from our controllers, and the more you work with it, the more it makes sense. But I know if you're brand new to it, it's kind of a hard conundrum to think about, but just keep with it. Since we're using file formats on our form, we need to actually add a multi-part to it. That's just kind of a process you'll need to when you're uploading files to a form. So you can do that with simple form by just comma separating this, passing HTML, and then passing multi-part true. You can do other parameters inside this block as well if you want. So here we're adding our inputs, and this is basically the pattern I've been using throughout all my series with the BOMA framework. You have to put its own class on the field, which is input in this case, and then I just tell the simple form to not include a wrapper, and then for the label we need a class of label on it. So that's the same all the way down. Here we're adding a front-end validation for max length of 7th on our price, so that's something to add as well. Let's see, so our model is the same. Control description is the same. We have a text area class here, so that's just a bigger field on the front end, this one. The brand is going to be a select field, and BOMA, I wanted it to be, this whole field I wanted to be like a 3-column layout because there's different characteristics you can set, and these aren't required by default when you upload an instrument, but it's just something that needs to be there if you need it. And you'll see all those brands that we added to our model are here now, and we're actually looping through those with a simple form property called collection. So we're passing in an input field here instead of an actual input, and that's just kind of a stripped away version of a simple form field. And with that, we can pass in the actual column and then a collection of that specified constant we created over here. So here it's brand in that case, and to access that we have to go to the model itself, 2 colons, and then the brand name that we gave it in all caps. And the same is true for finish and condition. So that's how that works. And you'll see those are having an is4 class, which basically floats them, or it's using flexbox, but it puts them all in line as you saw on the front end. And then finally, for our image field, we have quite a few markup classes here to make that look pretty. But we're passing in an input as the image, which is what we called our uploader in our field in the form, the one we pass through to our controller at the bottom here. And that's coming through on this end as a file field. And then we're adding the class of file input instrument image. And of course, we don't need a label there, so we turn that off. And the same is true for wrapper. So just choose a file. I added a little bit of dynamic JavaScript so that when you upload a file, you can see the preview of it in place. In our current project, I'll need to grab the images so we can show that by example. So with that done, we have our submit button and a cancel button. So let me add that JavaScript now that I'm thinking about it, and then we can go back and figure the rest out. I did it on instrument.js, so I don't write CoffeeScript. So I'm going to rename this. And I'm no pro at JavaScript. I published a video that just said I suck at JavaScript, so that's something to check out if you get a chance. So I'm gonna copy and paste this over. This is stuff I've compiled basically by scouring the web, for ideas on how to do this. But it's just kind of what has been working. It's not a fail-proof solution, but it does work. So I'll walk you through it. I think I can do that at least. I'm gonna just delete these comments. So since our app uses turbo links out of the box, you can see that it does if you check your gem file, which right here it does. We kind of need to bypass that so our JavaScript that we write works well and plays nicely. And to do that, we've got this all set up. I'm gonna read JavaScript. Here we go. And you basically need to declare an event listener and hook into the turbo links and listen for this event. And then when that's done loading, we can do our stuff. So here I've added that class called instrument image, which is right here on that field, the file field. And in that, we can actually do this function, which hooks into a file reader API that's kind of in your browser. I also did this on the Dribble clone I think I created a while back. This one's probably a little toned down compared to that one, but basically it hooks into that API and generates some HTML based on what comes back when you upload a file. So it's able to actually read that data that's come through and inject it into your browser in real time. And that's basically what's happening. So I'm just looking for a change on that event and then handling that with this function. So our image that we upload actually it displays when we're uploading it. So why don't I just actually put this to practice and see if everything's working. Before I do that, I need to actually get some images from our old project into our new one. So let me do that real quick. Okay, so I have one on the desktop as well as in the project, and you'll see why I need them in the project later, where we use this cool feature called seeding, which populates your database automatically for you. Yes, it'll be cool. So I'm just going to call this like PRS guitar to start with, and then give it a price of something crazy like, I don't know, something like that. And so then we can grab this, open, and pray it works. It does. Awesome. So we don't have our image field actually displaying here, but you saw when we did create a new instrument, I think it was working. Let me go back and edit that one actually, just to see if I add that file, it'll actually propagate. Yep. That's kind of what we want. It's doing the double thing because we're editing one, so it's injecting the one that was there before, but it is displaying it. So like I said, you could extend that JavaScript to be way better, but this is just more or less showing by example at this point. So I'm gonna hit cancel because I don't need to edit it. But you'll notice this is looking pretty ugly. It's just using a bunch of tables throughout, so we'll have to actually hook all that up in a minute. At this point, we do have our show page, our actual creation of an instrument page set up, and we can edit an instrument too. So we're looking pretty good. The actual look and feel probably needs to improve next, as well as the generation of these like actual shopping cart and all of that stuff, which gets kind of hard, but more or less we'll approach that when we get to it. So that will be coming up next. I think we're going to make this thing look a little bit prettier next. So I look forward to doing that with you. So stay tuned.